tiempo.
No me gusta de dormir con cabello en el despacho. Muy bien, la verdad. Muy bien. De gente bastante. Van a probarlo.
¿Cualquiera?
Y la semana que viene
Rocío y...
Then you can sit here in this way.
Yo creo que todo esto igual lo podemos hacer. Igual todo, ¿no? Igual. ¿Quieres dejarla? ¿Quieres dejar el ejecutivo?
If you can give me the back and that to put it here.
With the microphone, it's a magnet. It's a magnet. So when finish your presentation, I need you take off the microphone and sit here. Okay. Okay. It's very easy. Okay.
Thank you. I think that first there is a display, video display. So is it necessary for us to stay here while the video is?
I think it's in the finish of the table.
Okay. Gracias.
It's a magnet. You can put inside the dress. Okay. Thank you.
ንምልሽ እቺ ክር ትታያለች ቦግ ብላ ትደብረው
ምን ችግር አለ?
ኮቱ ላይ ገጨጭና እርገትን ወይ ነን አው እንዴ ሞባይል እንትኔንማ ተቀበለኝ እንጂ ኮምፒውተርን የተጋረገልኝ እዚህ ጋር እዚህ ነው ቡኒ ጥቁሩ ነው ከጥቁሩ ፊት አለ እሺ
No, el micrófono y la silla van unidos. Sí, son solamente. Son el mismo ente.
¿Cómo te
Sí, muy sencillo. Luego cuando termine os lo retiran. La pieza, si se cae, pues habrá que sacarla y ponerla.
No hay que prenderlo ni nada, ¿no?
No, ya lo controlo yo.
You have your translations? Yes. Did you try it?
Testing, this is the English translation. Testing, this is the English translation.
I see.
nervous is good. I'm sure, great.
A little bit I think.
That's
mine.
Also, የሽማግሌ ጆሮ
Testing, this is the English translation. Testing.
Estás seguros que se entienden?
Pero ellos no tienen pinganillo.
Sí. You have a
Yes.
headset?
yeah
Testing, testing, this is the English translation. Testing, testing, this is the English translation. Can you hear the English translation? Testing, testing, this is the English translation. Channel 2. Channel 2, this is the English translation. Can you hear the English translation? Raise your hand if you can. You can? Testing, testing.
Sin problema.
Testing, testing, English translation. This is the channel for the English translation. Testing, testing, English translation.
ትራንስሌሽን ሳይሆን ቤቷ ውስጥ ያለች እያንዳንዷ ጫጫታ ትሰማናለች በማይክ ውስጥ ወደ ላይ መግፋት ወደ ታች እንዴ አንቺ ተረኛ ነሽ ከእንጥቀት ምናምን እያሉ ሲያቀርቡ
Testing, testing, this is the English channel. Testing, testing, English channel. You can hear, great, thank you. Testing, this is the English channel. Testing, testing. Just checking that your colleague can hear as well. Could you check with him to see whether he can hear the English? Testing, testing, this is the English channel. Testing, testing, the English channel. Testing, testing, this is the English channel. Probably not on the right channel. Testing, this is the English channel. Testing, testing. Testing, testing.
Hola.
Empezamos.
Okay, let's begin. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, authorities, the rest of the guests this morning. Thank you for coming. I'm Loya Reyes. I'm a journalist from El País newspaper, and I'm going to chair this conference with the roundtables. And we're going to start with the World Day Against Violence Against Women, the 25th of November. So I'm not going to go into further details. We're going to start with a couple of words from the host, the director of Casa Árabe, Irene Lozano Domingo. Well, a very good morning to all of you, Secretaries of State, Ambassador. For us, it's a true honor, and I really say this from my heart, even though one tends to say this for protocol reasons. Since the Secretary of State for Cooperation got in touch with us in order to organize this event, and we did so with great enthusiasm and belief, and the day has come to eliminate violence against women and girls, and this is why we're here today, to see how feminist cooperation can contribute to eliminating violence against women and girls. 5 years ago, the Me Too movement broke out, and this brought about a general mobilization and an increase in global awareness in terms of the different types of violence that women suffer from, physical, sexual, or mental violence. And since then, this increase in global awareness, thanks to a great extent to the work of grassroots movements such as many of those of you who are here, such as many women who are here today, as champions of human rights, champions of the rights of women, and defenders of women who suffer from violence all over the world. This crystallized in the Me Too movement and contributed to creating that global awareness. Nevertheless, we have to take note of the fact that together with that increase in awareness, there has also been an increase in the public space that those people who want to break that consensus that they occupy, and that consensus in the sense that the fight against violence, in terms of violence against women, all types of violence, has to be a struggle on behalf of all of us. It has to be a common objective for all of us. We increasingly see more ultra-right movements and right-wing movements that get involved in the lives of women, and we need to take this into account because it will be decisive in our work in the next few years. So therefore, to support organizations of the rights of women and feminist movements is key. We do so in Casa Árabe, in the ministry, and it is essential in order to eradicate violence against women and girls. And therefore, for us to host this meeting today is an essential part of our mission, and as I say, it fills us with pride to welcome you here today. At the end of the day, it's the promise of the Sustainable Development Goals to not leave anybody behind, to leave no one behind, women or girls. And in Casa Árabe, we've given visibility to gender policies that are carried out in countries such as Tunisia, Libya, during our cycle of talks that we held here, held in 2022. There are specific phenomena that multiply violence against women, against which we have to be aware. The effect of lockdowns during the pandemic for COVID-19 created domestic contexts where it was easier, and there was a multiplication of the amount of abuse against partners, and the risk factors known to us increased, and they limited access to services for help and protection. Also, the humanitarian crisis and of displaced people makes the current situation against women worse within their partnerships and outside. And also, in those contexts, we saw that new forms of violence are generated against women. In addition, I want to underline a specific problem, which is the problem of female genital mutilation. And there are almost 4 million girls all over the world who run the risk of being victims of FGM, female genital mutilation, every year. And with all the work that is done in terms of this specific problem and the violence against women in general, there's the factor of knowledge and hope that I would underline, because we know for a fact that violence against women is not only can it be eradicated, but it can be prevented, because there are factors that are the perfect breeding ground to ensure that violence against women takes place. And we know that the health sector plays a very important role here. In fact, and this is what I most want to underline today, international cooperation. We know that there are millions of women in the world whose situation is dramatic, very extreme. And women in Afghanistan, for example, are probably the most extreme example we know about, but there are millions of women who suffer from violence, in many cases without even being aware of the fact that that is not normal. As the famous book of Miguel Llorente says, my husband hits me and it's normal. So there has to be, or work has to be done to foster that awareness. We also think it's essential to count on the support of the media, because in Spain, there is general consensus that Their work is essential to create that awareness in society about this problem. And over the last few days, the anniversary of the intervention on television in terms of Ana Orantes was decisive for the situation of violence that she suffered from, and this contributed to a quantitative leap forward in terms of awareness in Spanish society. So, in short, Spanish cooperation is essential in order to help and in order to take many women in the world out of a cycle of violence, and all the work in terms of generating know-how and the debate here is crucial too. So thank you very much for all attendees and participants, and I hope that it will be a very fruitful day of exchanging points of view and debate.
Gracias, señora Lozano.
Thank you ever so much. And today we have the pleasure of having two Secretaries of State from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they will be talking to us next. The first one will be Ángeles Moreno Bao, the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Global Affairs. Thank you.
Buenos días.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be in Casa Árabe. Irene Lozano, thank you very much for hosting this, or for chairing this meeting, and for continuing to collaborate on fostering the feminist foreign policy that you've been very much committed to, together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Dear colleague Pilar Lozano, Secretary of State for Cooperation, because we are celebrating the fact that the law has gone through the Parliament, and also the family, the Cooperation family, Fundación Carolina, and the Spanish Agency for International Cooperation for Development. You two are working on this from your secretariat, and Ambassador of Special Mission for Feminist Foreign Policy, which is also pushing forward our foreign policy in terms of feminist matters. Today, the 25th of November, we are commemorating a very sad event, the murder of the Sisters Mirabal in the Dominican Republic in 1960. But this has allowed us to constitute or to put together a package of events all over the world in order to remember that gender violence is a current affair in all of our societies, and we need to continue condemning this to try to ensure that this terrible fact can end. And the Secretary General of the United Nations in August of this year reminded us that the prevalence of gender violence is a practice that hasn't changed for the last 10 years. 1 of every 3 women is a victim of some type of violence, at least once in their lifetime. And this is unacceptable. All types of violence is unacceptable, but especially that violence that affects women who are in vulnerable situations because they have some type of disability, because of their age, or because of their sexual orientation, or their ethnic or cultural diversity. These are terrible events, such as forced marriages, which has been seen to have increased in the time that we were locked down because of COVID. The female genital mutilation is also unacceptable, that the director from Casa Árabe referred to. What is also unacceptable is that women cannot go to a classroom to get trained or to get education, as happens in Afghanistan. They can't follow study programs, and it's unacceptable that women should be the first who suffer from the phenomenon of trafficking and other types of violence when they are displaced because of situations of war, as we're seeing currently in Ukraine. And it's because women are the first to always become victims. And this happens with displaced women because of climate change. Women who are displaced in migrations, they're always the first victims. And Spain has always been at the forefront in the fight against gender violence. In 2004, we approved the comprehensive law against gender violence. And in 2007, the state agreement against gender violence. And the president or the head of government, Mr. Sanchez, committed last year for the feminist foreign policy with that same title, and it was very difficult to include that concept of feminist in this policy, but we managed to include it, and we try to act accordingly, and we are working very hard on this. So from Spanish Cooperation's point of view, as my colleague will be able to explain, the Secretary of State for Cooperation will explain, and also in different multilateral fora, political fora that we work in. For example, the Commission for the Social and Legal Standing of Women and all fora from this Council of Europe, the OSCE, the NATO. We worked in the Madrid Summit, and the work took place, women, peace and security, as part of our priorities, at the top of our list of priorities, and we will continue to do so during the presidency of Spain of the European Union. And we will do so in fields where there is not so much focus on this matter. For example, in digital access. In the field of digital matters, women are the first victims of violence, digital harassment, for example. And so we need to try and ensure that digital access needs to be looked at to help with the development of societies, and this access needs to be protected. So therefore, in foreign affairs, we're working a lot on this feminist foreign policy, and we work on the protection of Spanish women and citizens who are in third countries become victims of gender violence. So we have representation in our consulates to ensure that these women who are victims of gender violence receive specialized support, because they find themselves in a situation of vulnerability in those countries where they don't have a social or family network that can provide them with that much needed support. So we will continue working on feminist foreign policy, and I'm very pleased that we are organizing this event, because it's one of many that Spanish Cooperation and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has organized, and we will continue, therefore, to work on systemic, multilateral, bilateral meetings in order to ensure that this phenomenon, which is a burden, is eradicated. Thank you very much for your participation and for having come from other countries to be with us on such an important day as today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señora Moreno.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moreno, for your words. Let's continue with the last person who's going to welcome you this morning, who is Pilar Cancela, Secretary of State for International Cooperation.
Pues muy buenos días a todas.
A very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much, Lola, for your presentation, for your introduction, for being here with us this morning. And before anything, I'd like to thank Casarbe and to Irene for welcoming us. Right from the beginning, we thought it was a wonderful idea, and it's also an opportunity to share with you all the work, all that hard work you do on a daily basis to give importance to the work that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does. So thank you very much for the day-to-day work you do, which at the end of the day is what counts. Also, special greeting to my dear friend, Secretary of State INGLÉS. It's a pleasure to share the same space with you. You spoke before about the law for cooperation. I think we need to congratulate ourselves mutually, because there's also Juan Antonio, who's from the Carolina Foundation. There's always a groundwork that is laid down for future work, so there is a great deal of merit there, and we have to recognize that. So in any case, this is a very important step forward for the whole family of Spanish cooperation. We still have another step to take, which is the Senate, but I think things are moving in the right direction. At the moment, we have the director of the agency is not here, unfortunately. He is elsewhere, but he will join us, and we'll greet him personally. Dear Ambassador, on a special mission too for feminist foreign policy, which is great to have you here today as well, and to underline this feminist foreign policy, which is not a slogan or a logo, it's a political commitment, and that is how we should define it. Also, thank you to all of you, NGOs who are here, the family of Spanish Cooperación, and some were here yesterday with us at the Parliament. It's good to see you here as well. And a special greeting to the illustrious speakers that we have here today who have come from other countries to join us from Ethiopia and Colombia. So thank you ever so much for coming. Thank you very much for joining us. So we are here to celebrate, but that's not the word actually. We're on the 25th of November, yet another year. In yet another year, we talk about violence against women and violence, all types of violence against women and girls. And the first question we should ask ourselves is whether anything's changed versus the previous year, whether the demands we made last year, whether any have been successful and are no longer on the list because things have been achieved or not. But I would say that unfortunately progress is extremely slow, especially because there is quite a common tendency, and there are cycles that repeat themselves over history, that when we live through a situation of economic recession or crisis of whatever nature, there tends to be a tendency to go back in time in all things that were achieved in terms of freedom for women. And just by coincidence, that's where most backward steps are taken. So in these difficult times is when we need to be stronger, we need to be more united and make many more demands than ever. We are all very much aware of the fact, and we all share, that gender violence and chauvinist actions is a cruel manifestation of inequality against with women. And what there is a prior breeding ground, a prior situation of certain situations for women that ensures that in the end it's the most terrible consequence of that inequality. But of course the conditions in order to live through life in all areas, whether it's a labor, work, family, social, these are conditions that persist in the society which is patriarchal, which has these differences deeply rooted in society. And this is what prevents us from developing ourselves as citizens in the same conditions as males. And I think that one of the milestones when we talk about, as Angeles mentioned, the terrible case that happened to Ana Orantes, I think that this was a milestone in Spanish society because this gave visibility of what was actually happening within homes, within people's houses, those things that were not spoken about. And people told us to mind our own business, that it was their business, and it was families matters that did not wasn't known as a social problem. But I think that it was like a signal to the whole of Spanish society, and this feminist movement was able to witness this terrible situation and to push this matter forward. Unfortunately, at the time there was a government in power that was sensitive to this, because the demands of civil society are essential for progress to be made. If civil society doesn't make a push for this on behalf of feminist organizations and NGOs, it was very difficult for there to be able to have a basis on which to build. And there has to be somebody to listen for this building to take place, because otherwise it's impossible. And at that time, as Angeles said, there was a very important package of legislation adopted in Spain that made us into a benchmark, a pioneer, and we continue to be so. It's a shame that in the last few years there hasn't been so much push behind this, but still. And in the end, this type of violence doesn't know anything about social classes, ideologies, or academic training, or countries, or populations that one belongs to. We're talking here about a global phenomenon. And why is that? Because underlying all this is a patriarchal structure in society. And it seems that it's hard to listen to this for some people. But I think we should never tire of saying this, because that is the root of the problem. It's a structural problem in our society, and unfortunately, in the last few generations of young people, there's information that tells us that there is a backward movement in this idea of equality between men and women in terms of respect, human rights of women, because that's what we're talking about at the end of the day, something as basic as human rights. So therefore, in the end, it's a question of annulling or undermining women as citizens, as owners of rights and as citizens. And when the citizenship of women is weakened, what is weakening is 50% of society of where we're living, and our democracy therefore is not complete, and our democracy is not a true democracy in that case. So therefore we're talking about the existence of how we conceive our society, how we conceive our state, and how we conceive the environment in which we're living. The Istanbul Convention defines what this gender violence is all about, and it gives us a catalogue of the different types of gender violence: physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, economic violence, political violence. And I don't say this just because of what's happening in Spain. We know about many colleagues in many countries where forming part or being activists in politics is a reason for discrimination and even harassment and persecution. How many women are part of the electoral lists and then they are forced to give up those positions that they have acquired because of political will for then men to occupy those positions? This is just a small example, but it is indicative of what's happening in the world. Forced marriages, Secretary of State mentioned this, abolition, prostitution, trafficking. And as we can see, the list is long. And when we talk about prostitution and trafficking, we're talking about a business, a profitable business, which is part also, in some cases, of the GDP of countries. And therefore, it is dreadful, this. But this is the environment, this is the reality that we're facing up to. And at the moment, we're talking about the renewal of the state agreement on gender violence, which was a milestone at the time, because we realized that it wasn't sufficient just to have laws, that laws are important, but that if there are no policies and programs that develop those laws further and lead to the adoption of specific policies, then the legal framework is void of any meaning. And that is why the backing of the Pact of State is so important. And this is why it's going to be renewed. And this is now the time to do this. And finally, obviously, I need to point out something about cooperation, because that is what we're here for today. Yesterday was a very special day, because in the Parliament, the draft law for international cooperation and development was approved, and also for global solidarity in our country. And one of the things that defined our cooperation in the world, and we always say this, it's because it's a state policy, it's part of our foreign policy, and the foreign policy in Spain is a feminist foreign policy, because international cooperation and development is feminist, and it's a public policy. And we always like to underline that it is feminist, feminist, feminist. And people are bothered by us saying this, and it shouldn't bother you, because that is what it truly is. This is what we have been doing for more than 40 years. Our people who cooperate with us abroad, when they work on site, that is exactly what they do. They apply programs, projects, in order to combat inequality and to fight against gender violence. So therefore we need to normalize the concept and not give it a pejorative meaning. I mean, why is it bad to say that foreign cooperation is feminist? We're trying to fight for women and girls to have the same opportunities and the same rights as women, as men, and that's exactly what it's all about. It's that simple. And therefore, in that respect, I think that out of all the 2030 objectives and goals, I think there's one, number 5, which is particularly cross-cutting, which is comprehensive, and that really covers all the others, and that is very clear to us. And that is exactly what we do in our day-to-day work, but not just us from the ministry. In the ministry, we too do our bit on a multilateral level and bilateral level in all fora where we're present, but also it's our women and men who cooperate with us in all those places where they find themselves. And in many of those places, there are very difficult situations where there's conflict and where people who might not be cooperating with us wouldn't want to be. So this is our ID. It's women who cooperate with us, men who cooperate with us, and the profile of these workers and these cooperation workers, they're generally women over 35 years old who cooperate in Africa with us. These cooperation workers, this is the prototype of what they are, and this is what our Spanish cooperation is all about. So I think this is essential, and I think it identifies us. Africa is a fundamental priority for us, just as Latin America is, which has been the case for many years now. So I'm not going to go into more details now. I just simply want to say that when we do cooperation, what are we trying to combat? What are we trying to achieve through our work? We're talking about poverty here. We're talking about hunger. We're talking about combating those situations that are not optimum in terms of health and education. We're talking about water, clean water and health, the ecological transition, climate change. And we're talking above all about one thing, and that is that all these situations should lead, they all lead to situations of vulnerability. And those that find themselves in the situations of most vulnerability are women. And that is what we're working on in cooperation, to ensure that no one remains or gets left behind, because we want to be free. And this is why we're going to cooperate on a daily basis every day of the year. Not only today, which is a day to remember this, but it's to get more strength and to be more and more convinced of the fact that that is what we have to do in our work. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señora. Thank you, Ms. Cancela. Your words make me feel optimistic after all. Now, we're going to begin the two panels. As has been said here, we could spend weeks talking about all the different forms of violence against women that exist, and we would still not have time. But for today, we've chosen two issues that are of great concern because they affect millions of women and girls all around the world. And before continuing, I would like to encourage those of you who are here and those who are following us online to disseminate everything that's being said here. You see the two hashtags here in Spanish, so the message doesn't stay between these four walls, so it's spread around the world. So let's start the first panel with a prestigious international panel with people from Colombia, Ethiopia. It's a bilingual panel, so I hope you all have your headsets. And I'm going to introduce our guests who are going to tell us what they do. And in the end, we'll have time for Q&A from the audience. So first of all, we have Mario Fanjul, who's a coordinator of the Technical Cooperation Office in Ethiopia. Welcome. Then we have Abebwa Bogale, coordinator of the National Alliance to put an end to child marriage and female genital mutilation. Fraser Abera, part of the Set Away movement. I hope I'm saying your names right. I'm sorry. Then we have Rocío Muñoz, who's a regional advisor of the United Nations Population Fund. And then virtually online, on a different time zone, we have Ana Huesmes, director of the Division of Gender Affairs of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So we'll begin with Mario, who's going to introduce a video and give us a little presentation. So I'm going to make my presentation first. So thank you very much, Lola, Secretary of State, Casa Árabe. The truth is that when my boss invited me to participate, I said no, because I thought I wasn't the right person to be on this panel, and much less to inaugurate it. But then I remembered concerts in my village when the bad groups play first, and that's why I thought, okay, I'll play first then. So I hope I'm a good lead-in to my excellent colleagues here at the panel. And after hearing Pilar Cancela, Secretary of State for Cooperation, I realize it's worthwhile being here. It's a day in which we should congratulate each other on how the Spanish Congress passed the law yesterday. And we have to remind ourselves that we're very clearly feminist cooperation. And if someone's offended by that, well, then they should seek professional advice if they're offended by that. So I think that this feminist cooperation is very necessary now that we're seeing this reversal of human rights in places like Ethiopia, where I have the pleasure of working with excellent professionals like the ones we have here, and also in Latin America. In Ethiopia, the second most populated country in Africa, the sixth economy in the continent, the seat of regional institutions, with strongly affected by climate change, with 110 million inhabitants, where 70% of the population is under the age of 30 and 40% are under the age of 15. And this creates a demographic dividend that is highly significant, and it's a great challenge for the development of women and girls who, in such a young population, are more and more vulnerable to internal crises, to climate change and other development-related issues. In recent years, the legal framework on gender equality in Ethiopia improved significantly. The criminal code was amended. There was a labor reform. There was a legislation on gender in Ethiopia. There's equality that is reaching 50% in participation in the assembly, a president who's a woman, but we're still in a country that's full of challenges, in which 80% of women state that they've suffered some kind of abuse on the street. A country in which 30% of women do not receive any type of income. A country where 30%, 3 out of 7 women have suffered domestic violence, in which illiteracy among women is 60%, in which 10% of teenage girls have children before the age of 13, and in which 65% of women have suffered FGM. And in some areas, such as Afar and Somali, the proportion is 95%. This situation undoubtedly pushes us to take steps as Spanish Cooperation in responding to gender inequality in Ethiopia as a partner country of Spain. But we have to explain that child marriage is also gender violence. It's funny, but we have to explain that. And so that's one of the challenges we're combating from Spanish Cooperation. Among women aged from the age of 25 to 49, 60% of them, 6 out of 10, were married before the age of 18. And among those women, 30% under the age of 15. And we're talking about 110 million inhabitants. And in the same survey, which is a public survey conducted by the government of Ethiopia, the average age for marriage of women between the ages of 25 and 49 was 17. And of course there are variations. 13, 14 years in certain rural areas, and 24 years in larger cities like Addis Ababa. And also with regard to education, 24 years for women with secondary education, or 16 years for women without any studies. Of course, poverty is a risk factor. Girls, as we will hear later, girls are married in commercial operations. They're considered a profit for their families who hand over their daughter because they receive a dowry in exchange. And the family receiving this daughter gets cheap labor in exchange for the dowry. In a visit we made a couple months ago, we conducted a study of relations with mothers-in-law, and to see what kind of social dynamics there were that foster the maintenance of these kind of early marriages. But above all, in addition to the factor of poverty, there's a factor of violence, of control over bodies, a transaction, controlling the transaction and controlling decisions made regarding women's and girls' bodies. Obviously, child marriage is gender violence. 6 out of 10 women, as I said, were married under the age of 18, and only 1 out of 10 men married before they were 18. So I think the figures speak for themselves. As I was saying, of course, violence is a key factor in this child marriage relations, which is a violation of women's bodily independence and basic human rights. This is not domestic violence, as it's a social problem. It's a violation of rights. It's a gender-based violence. And Spanish cooperation has an added value in gender issues because we have a master plan, we have a gender strategy, we have feminist foreign policy, but we're not the only ones acting on the ground. The European Union has a gender policy for their external action. Other European partners have equivalent feminist policies. And in our new partnership framework with Ethiopia, gender will be mainstreamed and will also be a vertical element. It will be cross-cutting in sectors such as health and rural development, but we will also have a specific component for gender-based violence and women's empowerment. And the reason we're doing this is because we do this with other partners, with regional governments, with the Ministry of Women and Social Affairs, with the federal government, with Spanish NGOs, which can reach areas that we can't reach, with multilateral stakeholders, with the UN Women Fund, and with civil society, with magnificent grassroots movements that are just beginning, but will change the political and social agenda of Ethiopia, such as the Setawit movement. And Fraser will be able to tell us more about that. The experience, the commitment of Spanish cooperation are hallmarks in building this feminist cooperation that seeks to leave no one behind, and we're very proud of saying that we are feminist cooperation, and we want to be a benchmark for the European Union, for our partners in Europe and in Ethiopia, in reducing all kinds of gender-based violence. And since I'm that bad artist before the really good artist, I want to invite you to travel to a small village close to Gondar, one of the historic cities of Ethiopia, where Spanish cooperation is promoting an initiative together with the Setawit feminist movement to work with circles of married girls and then Fraser will be able to tell us more about that. So we can start the video now.
Vamos el vídeo, a ver si lo pueden poner.
Thank you, Mario, for your words, for the video. As we've seen, forced marriage is a form of violence against girls, and it might sound forgotten, but for us, it's on the top of our agenda. And so our next panelist will be able to tell us more. Abeba Bogale will be able to tell us more about that. You have the floor.
Thank you for Spanish Cooperación. Okay. And all of you who have facilitated this program for us, I would like to extend my greetings for the Spanish people on behalf of their government who pass the boundaries of language and other barriers to show their global solidarity to the people where Spanish is not spoken at all. So I am really proud of the Spanish cooperation and their real interventions, not just like a show off, but they go deep in the education sector, they go deep in the health, they go deep, now they have started going deep in the gender inequality where intervention is most needed and where overlooked. So my topic is just to show you a little bit about child marriage in Ethiopia, or already Mr. Mario, which is our best supporter in the country, which we all rely on. Not as he mentioned, but he's really making a big difference there because he's very close to the community, very close to the people. And also he introduced us a lot to the Spanish people, the Spanish way of seeing things, including feminist approach, which I never know before I start working with the Spanish Cooperación. So I am telling you that this is a real life, not just a thing of the past or something different, but it is really happening today, now. As we are sitting here, children below the age of 18 are either in labor or in marriage or whatever. You see, not simple things that put as figures, but when you go to rural areas, you will find a 15-year child with one baby on her hand and another in her belly. So this is a reality which Spanish Cooperación started intervention on. And if you see the real children who were proposed for a marriage, you will cry by thinking of your children or your parents, your relatives' children. So in that big country, Spanish Cooperación selected a place where this child marriage is extremely severe, not like mentioned in the percentage law, but almost nearly all rural women will marry below the age of 18. It is a place where Spanish is now intervening, one of the areas. So not only that, but also we are working on FGM, which I am not talking today. The other thing what Spanish do is that selected 2 of the regions in Ethiopia for intervention on child marriage. These 2 regions constitute 63% of Ethiopian population. Imagine how big it is. But they can't address both all, so they proposed to select some limited districts, 15 districts, and the intervention took place in those districts with selected what we call qabeles, but they are like counties or something like that. So in Ethiopia, the legal age for marriage is 18 as an international law, but is it respected in the country or in the countryside? Definitely no. You see, that is the case. Are the girls, those who are married, have the right to go to school? Definitely no. Very few who have the chance to go to school after marriage will quit immediately when they become pregnant. In the first place, after marriage, most of them do not get the right to go to school, but those who got the right to go to school after marriage will quit their education when they are pregnant, which is between the age of around 13, 14, 15, and so on. So the impact of child marriage is not as simple as what we think. The whole rights of the child and the girl is already violated once she is given out of her will because below 18, the Ethiopian constitution and the Ethiopian criminal code says any person who is below the age of 18 cannot give consent and cannot marry, because they can't give consent. But they say they marry before that, so the violation starts there. Once their right is violated, all of their life will change for bad. Imagine a young girl who is not educated, who has no experience of life. How can she give a baby and give the best opportunity in life? Even simple opportunity as primary education. So this is what child marriage really is, and it is happening in the country. Even though we say child marriage is universal and it is practiced in all over the country, in every place, in every culture. In Ethiopia, we are extremely divided and diverse society, like 82 languages, which one cannot understand, the other speaks all over the country. But with that situation, across all cultures, child marriage is common. In no culture that child marriage is not practiced, no. In all, it is practiced. But the severity varies. For example, in one of our Spanish-supported intervention areas, it goes as low as 5-6 years. But the common year is like 13, 14 for a marriage. And just I want to tell you that those who survived, two of those who survived that child marriage have already get deployed by the project supported by Spanish Cooperación, and they are teaching now the community to end child marriage. But they were themselves married at the age of 1 at the age of 5, the other at the age of 7. They are working with us for the last 3 months by promoting the community. So this is the severe one, but there are many, many other forms of practices, harmful practices that needs intervention. But the scale is not comparable to child marriage. The other forms of harmful practices include female genital mutilation, arranged marriage, uvula cutting. I don't know whether you know it. The children will cut their uvula. Some of them die. Even this year, 8 children died in one hospital because of uvula cutting. So that practice is still going on. Milk teeth extraction, dowry, marriage by abduction, inheritance marriage. There is an inheritance marriage, exchange marriage. If I took someone's sister, I have an obligation to give my sister as an exchange. There is also food prohibition for pregnant mothers. Like there are different foods in each culture, it varies, but the pregnant mother should not take. Imagine like prohibiting milk for a pregnant mother is how devastating it is, just starting from that. And many other like excessive feast, cutting the body of people either for ornamental or other reasons and so on. So the worst of all is like abandoning a child. There is also a culture of abandoning a child when they are born, like if their first teeth comes from either from the up or the lower, they are seen as cursed. Even a girl given at the age of 12, if she becomes pregnant at the age of, before the approval of the community to be pregnant, that child will be abandoned because it is a curse, like a curse. There are a lot of harmful practices which we need to deal, but none of them reach the extent of child marriage. All legal things are, all legal provisions are there in the country. The constitution do not allow this, the law do not allow this, and all international laws which are signed and ratified by Ethiopia are seen as part of the constitution of Ethiopia by the constitution article 9.4. that all signed agreements are considered part of the constitution of Ethiopia. So Ethiopia signed already Child Rights Convention and Human Rights Convention and many others. So all that are seen as part of Ethiopia's constitution. So there is no that big loophole in the constitution or in the criminal code. The problem is who will take this in action. Who are the policies who are expected to take the action to take these people to court when they marry at the age of 13 or 14 or 15? Because they themselves are practicing that, and sometimes you see the police who are supposed to take this case to the court are part of the ceremony and firing their given machine gun from the government by enjoyment to celebrate the feast of child marriage, you see. That much the people are already in it, so they can't understand how it is. So no policy problems, but no other gaps, but implementing them is a gap where interventions are very much needed. So now let me pass to what we have already done with the contribution of Spanish cooperation. Using the Spanish cooperation resource, the Spanish comes that we are committed to gender equality on the Sustainable Development Goal, Goal 5, sub-goal 5.3, where harmful practices should be avoided, including FGM and child marriage. So with that end, also they told us that we want to support the national roadmap to end child marriage and FGM, which is formulated by the government of Ethiopia for the 5 years. And when they come with us, so we told them our problem and how to go about it. They completely agreed with that. And we asked them to support the National Alliance to End Child Marriage and FGM, where all actors are part of this alliance. The government actors, Ministry of Women, Ministry of Child, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Legal, all are part. So with this, we told them, and now they come with a program all aligned with the National Roadmap to End Child Marriage and FGM. Using these, all coordinations at all levels. Thank you. I'll finish. Just a minute.
Muchas gracias, Conseguinalo. Gracias por tu intervención.
Thank you very much for your intervention. We will now give the floor to Fraser Abera.
Thank you so much for inviting us to attend this wonderful international conference. We are grateful for Spanish Corporation and other partners from Spain government for your all unwavering support and kindness you extended to Ethiopian women and girls in rural area. We appreciate every effort and support. Thank you. Okay, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Fraser Abera. I am a project coordinator in one of a first and prominent feminist organization, so-called Setawit. Setawit in Amharic is a woman. It's a first women rights movement. It was established in July 2024 by a group of feminists just to create a space for Ethiopian women to discuss and challenge this social, all forms of gender inequality and gender-based violence. The movement has, I just want to see I'm getting nervous, I'm sorry. I never been in international event, so I am a bit nervous. I'm sorry for that. Okay. as I said earlier, Setawit is a first and prominent feminist leading organization in Ethiopia. The movement have been involved in different initiatives that are moving the fight for gender equality in Ethiopia one step further. Setawit engage in social and policy dialogue, research, and advocacy to enforce the government to have a gender sensitive and feminist policies and implementation on the ground. So we have doing several projects and initiatives with different partners in order to create a conducive environment where all women can have a voice and take part in the development of the country. So from the work we have doing, from the initiative we are doing, one is the child marriage project. We work with a Spanish corporation. So Setawit, with unwavering technical and financial support of the Office of a Spanish Corporation, we launched and implemented a project titled Developing the Leadership Capacity of Young Women and Movement Building in southern region of Ethiopia. And the program is focused on supporting girls aged between 10 to 18 who have experienced child marriage in two waradas. I don't know if you know the warada. It's just like a district. So, and the project also support the creation of a feminist circle in one of higher institutions, so-called Debre Tabor University, and selected primary school in Debre Tabor town in South Gondar zone of Ethiopia. The main objective of this program is to contribute to the full and effective participation of women in all leadership, in all level of leadership and political and public life, with a special emphasis on education and violence prevention. The overall goal of this project is to establish appropriate and effective mechanism to protect and support girls at age 10 to 18 who were forced by early marriage, and adolescent girls who have been victim of child marriage and gender-based violence in Ethiopia. So this we call it Tasfawit project, ending child marriage project. One of the projects we are closely working with, as I said earlier, the project we are working with a Spanish corporation, we call it Tasfawit, giving hope, because most of those young girls they doesn't have any hope. So we just call it in Amharic, Tasfawit, giving hope for those who, for those young ladies who have been left behind by the society and community. So this project, this project is, okay, thank you so much for your understanding. This is really solidarity and sisterhood. Thank you. Okay, this project is sought to be benefit married girls in the two waradas, which is close to Debre Tabor town, and early marriage, which is a major and severe issue in the region. So in order to support those girls, we developed a discussion manual. First, we had a discussion with a local authorities partner who is working in a similar context, religious leaders, gatekeepers, mother-in-law, and other different stakeholders in order to assess the prevalence rate of the issue. Then we got 215 young girls who have been experienced early marriage, FGM, and other gender-related issues. So after the selection, we develop a discussion manual which helps them to enhance their voices, to create them a space so that they can speak freely without any judgment, without anybody, without any gatekeeper. So we create a space so-called Setawit circle. Under this circle, we have okay. Okay. So, the session give them, as I said earlier, the session for each circle are running on bi-weekly basis for 12 sessions. So the session gives them a space to discuss various topics such as healthy marriage, relationship, femininity, healthy masculinity, self-love, sisterhood, solidarity, activism, community activism, project design, saving, family planning, and aspiration, dreams, and so on. In this project, project, we have a male engagement program as well, so that the men can be an ally for gender-based, for early marriage prevention. And we have a community conversation dialogue, so that we gather different stakeholders to take part and prevent such kind of early marriage and other gender-based violence problems. And the other tool we use in order to enhance this project is Sisterhood and Solidarity Circle. We don't want our girls to feel they are left behind, so that we invite some of the university and public school students to spend time and discuss on issue that makes them common, and stand together to fight against any violence in the community. The last component we use in this project is economic empowerment initiative, because as Abeba and Mr. Mario told us, one of the reasons who push a family to give their their child to marriage is because of economic. So we saw those issues, so we designed an economic empowerment project so that young girls, those who our target group or beneficiary, came with a project so that Spanish Cooperación and Setawit together, they give them grants so that they can help their family as well. Those are the things we are doing. Above all, I want to thank Mr. Mario. He is an amazing feminist leader, especially not only for Setawit, for other social grassroots movement in Ethiopia. He is helping us in every possible way to move the agenda forward, and we want to thank you for all his effort and his team member doing the amazing work they are doing. We thank you so much, sir.
Muchas gracias, Tracer. Gracias por tu intervención y disculparlas.
Thank you very much for your intervention, but we have many other speakers. We have Ana Huezmes with us today. She's in Santiago de Chile, and I think it's 7 a.m. there, so you have the floor. We cannot hear the speaker, sorry.
Estamos bajito.
Yo escucho con mucho eco, no sé
No.
si ahora ya me escucháis bien. Hola, hola, ¿me escuchan? Hola, 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 hola.
A ver, Ana, ahora esto tampoco se oye. Creo que... A ver, ¿se me oye? ¿Por aquí no se me oye ya? Sí, bueno, mientras arreglan los problemas de sonido con Ana, vamos a escuchar a Rocío, que viene de Colombia. Rocío Muñoz, te cedo la palabra.
Para darle la palabra. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. First of all, I want to thank you, and I would like to greet you on behalf of the Population Fund of the UN. I want to thank the Spanish Cooperación for the invitation. This is a very important meeting. I'm from Panama, although I'm originally from Peru. So, well, we are Latin American, that's for sure. I'm also affected by the jet lag. I feel like it's the evening already, so well, thank you. Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you, all of you, for being here with us today. As you have said, this is a very important day. We are celebrating a very important date. We want to urge governments, civil society, the academic world, so that together we can overcome this dramatic situation in which women, children, and teenagers are the main victims. Today, the 25th of November, it's a very important date, and we need to mark this date in our agendas. So I would like to touch upon some of the issues that we're dealing with in the United Nations Fund, so that we can have some information regarding the context in our region when it comes to child marriage and gender violence. And then with the intervention of Ana Huezmes, we will have all the complementary interventions and informations. The main idea that I would like to share with you today has to do with the fact that Latin America is the only region in the world where there was not a decrease in the number of child marriage from the last 25 years. We have a stable figure, and we are the second region in the world when it comes to teenage and child pregnancy. 1 out of 5 girls in Latin America has been married before she turns 18. Without concrete interventions, we have calculated that in 2030 more than 20,000 girls would have been married before they are 18. And in that case, Latin America will become the first in the ranking for child marriage. And this is something that is quite worrying. We are deeply concerned because it affects the possibility the development possibility of our children, girls, teenagers, and it has to do with gender violence, inequality, poverty, and it's obviously a violation of human rights. I think that in Latin America, we need to acknowledge that there are several circumstances that have to do with child marriage. There are social and gender rules that are maintaining stereotypes because women have less access to their rights, they don't have access to power structures, and that means that they are not able to have a full enjoyment of their rights. In Latin America, we need to take this into account. As it was said before, 1 out of 3 women is a victim of gender violence in the case of their partners or ex-partners. And there's also a lack of public policies, comprehensive public policies with an adequate budget, with a cross-cutting budget in order to tackle this problem of child marriage. The statistical data that we have is not enough, and we need to be able to gather more data when it comes to the situation of these children and teenagers in forced marriages. This is very important for the design of public policies, because if we don't have the data, then we won't have the public policy to tackle the problem. There's also an important issue that we need to take into account, and it has to do with teenager pregnancies. And it is very important to have comprehensive sexual education. It has to be included in all the policies in our countries. There is also something else which is very important, and it has to do with racism and discrimination. We saw that gender violence and these negative actions have an impact on the lives of children, teenagers, and women. This gender approach allows us to see that there are specific inequalities. And in Latin America, we also need to have a deep analysis with a cross-cutting approach, with an intercultural approach, because migrant children, for instance, or in minority groups, they are subject to specific gender violence and specific inequality problems. So gender is not the only category that we need to take into account when we tackle all these problems. We need to have a multi-sectoral approach, because race, gender, country of origin, they all give rise to new categories and new situations for discrimination. It is important to highlight that in Latin America, girls in rural areas, migrant girls, will have a higher risk of suffering child marriage. There is also something else that I would like to mention today, and it has to do with what we're doing. In the United Nations Fund, we have 3 results taken into account for the strategic plan. The first result is zero violence, zero gender violence against women and children, including FGM and child marriage. So these strategic results are crucial in order to promote the eradication of child marriage. In this context, we need to mention that in Latin America we have a reference group so that we can have a comprehensive intervention model in order to prevent and eradicate child marriage. And this reference group in Latin America has the participation of representatives from the government, the academic sector, civil society, UN agencies, so that we can prepare an intervention model, and we want to have it as soon as possible. And that was also possible with the help of the Spanish Cooperación, ICID, and international cooperation, because this is a project to put an end to these negative practices against women and children in Latin America. It is also very important to mention that we are making a great effort in order to have a thorough analysis regarding political and regulatory frameworks in different countries. We also have a dialogue with several governments so that we can have cross-cutting policies. For instance, in the Dominican Republic, they have a specific policy for the prevention and eradication of child marriage and teenager pregnancy. And we are also working in an ecological framework so that we can highlight different interventions, so that we can have the individual level, the community level, the institutional level, all taken into account. Girls, teenagers must be the priority of public policies, and their needs, their demands have to be taken into account so that we can create public policies and all the different actions needed to prevent and eradicate child marriage. There are many more things to tell, but I know we don't have much time, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
De Panamá.
So, well, I'm from Peru, but I live in Panama. I also work from Colombia. Okay. So quickly, we will now give the floor to Ana Güemes. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Welcome. Thank you. Thank you very much, Lola. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I would also like to greet all my colleagues there. I would have loved to be there with you in Casa Árabe, with Irene Lozano, with Ángeles Moreno and Pilar Cancela. I want to thank the Spanish Cooperación for their invitation today. I received the invitation through José Luis Burgos, and I would like to say hello to him as well. Today, well, it's very early here in Chile, and on this 25th of November, it is true that we have more and more people committed to put an end to inequality, to discrimination, to gender violence, so that we can transform our policies, cultural initiatives, and implement these feminist measures. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm Spanish. As you know, I work in the case of multilateralism, and when it comes to European countries, in Spain we have this feminist policy, and we also have two other countries, Mexico and Chile, which are willing to have this feminist foreign policy, and Colombia mentioned that as well in the 15th Regional Conference on Women. I would like to also greet the human rights activists and cooperation workers who fight against gender violence and the violence against women. We want to be free. That's the motto of this foreign policy. I was not able to go to Spain because today we're going to launch our report regarding feminicide, and we cannot forget that sexism kills. And here we talk about the fact that we want to be free and we want to be alive. So this is a difficult situation. In the CEPAL, we are facing several crises at the same time. Yesterday, we presented the social panorama, and there is a fact: 32% of the population in the region live in poverty, and we are now facing an opportunity to transform the development model. As Rocío mentioned before, I think it's very important to take this data into account, and these are the data for Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay. Can you see that on your screen? Okay, yeah. So first of all, I would like to tell you that in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have a gender equality observatory. It was created in 2007 in the Conference for Women in the region, and the Spanish Cooperación has been cooperating with this observatory from the beginning. Rocío has mentioned the importance of statistical data. We need to break this statistical silence, and the first thing the feminist movement did was to break the silence, and we need to break this statistical silence as well. We need to have statistical data, and we are currently working on this awareness raising. We have 3 different types of autonomy: economic autonomy, physical autonomy. This is an observatory that we have for many countries. We have the technical secretariat, we have the cooperation of ICID, but we also have other UN agencies working with us. And from the year 2020, we have decided to incorporate the child marriage indicator. It was included in the SDGs, and it is also included with other indicators as well. Feminicide, for instance, and teenage pregnancies. This is the, well, you can see the region there, and it's very important to see that the figure has not changed in the last 25 years. So there were many conventions that were ratified. Gender equality was included in the law, but there was no real change. One in 5 girls was subject to a child marriage, and this is quite common in the area before they are 18. We have several indicators, but we are currently working with these figures, and we are working with UN Women, UNICEF, among others, and you have the data there. You can see countries above 30%, Suriname, Belize, the Dominican Republic, Guyana, among others, and there are just 4 countries with a figure of less than 20% of prevalence. Rocío was saying that this is something that normally happens in rural areas with poor families, in small villages and towns, and we are working with the Indigenous Women Network in the region, and this is obviously a negative practice, but if you want to have a look at the legal framework, you can see that there are 12 countries in which these child marriage practices are forbidden, but there are 12 where it is allowed from 16 to 18 years old, and there are some countries that consider that these child marriage situations are justified in some cases. So this is an issue that has to do with discrimination, of course. It's a negative practice, and as the colleagues from Ethiopia have just said, this is quite common in these countries. That is why it has been included in the 2030 agenda as violence. It is violent. It is hurtful for girls, for teenagers, and it's also violence for our societies. You can see our publications there. We are preparing now a very important change for the development model. We want to have a society of care, a society in which we take care of each other and of the family, and we want to have this interdependence model based on feminist principles. And when it comes to child marriage, and with these I come to the end of my first intervention, when it comes to child marriage, one of our main contributions in CEPAL is the sexual division of work. I mean, child marriage has to do with teenage pregnancies, loss of education opportunities, but we also had many inquiries and polls in the region, and we saw that, for instance, married girls allocate almost 1 day of work to domestic work, 47 hours in Guatemala a week, 46 in Mexico, 40 in Colombia. That is more than double that in the case of girls who are not in a child marriage, and obviously much more than boys. So this is a problem not just from the violence perspective, but it also has a great impact on labor, on working hours, and this is something that we wanted to take into account because it means a great loss of opportunities and the promotion of gender inequalities, and it comes from the beginning. Also, it has to do with the intergenerational transmission of poverty, and with this I come to the end of the first presentation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ana.
Thank you very much, Anna. So that's the end of this panel, and we're doing a little bit badly for time, so we'll just have a 5-minute break and then we'll start our next roundtable. In fact, I'll ask them all to start coming up now and get their microphones on, and while we try and sort out the technical matters, and then you can just have a short break, and in 5 minutes let's see ourselves back here. Thank you. Thank you very much to the speakers too.
Hola, buenos días a todas y a todos. Soy María Jesús Conde.
I'm Maria Jesus Conde, the ambassador for the feminist foreign policy, and I'm very grateful to Spanish Cooperación that has asked me to moderate this session. I'm going to talk about what it means for Spain, because not everybody is aware about what this is all about. And it is true that international cooperation has a great track record in terms of work and gender equity, the fight against gender violence and protection of women and girls. But this policy was launched about a year and a half ago, and it's a further step forward where the Spanish government has taken on a commitment and a firm determination to include gender equality and the rights of women and girls in all actions and all statements on a multilateral level and in the field of cooperation. So not only are we working in the area of cooperation, but above all, in the last year, we have increased the defense of human rights of women and equality in political, bilateral relationships, multilateral relationships, regional relationships, and in the work that is carried out by the consulates. And I'm just going to focus briefly on the fact that the gender violence delegation is handing out a prize to the DG for Consulate Matters abroad for the work that our consulate offices have organized in protecting women and girls that are victims of male violence abroad. Our colleague Tara Bastil is receiving this prize, and it really fills us with great pride. Spain is part of a list of countries that have a foreign policy, such as Sweden, which unfortunately this year, because of the recent change in government, has withdrawn. It was at the forefront originally in the feminist movement, but Canada is next, Mexico, Luxembourg, France, Spain, and in last year, as Ana Güemes mentioned, Chile and Colombia. Mexico had feminist policies before Spain in that respect. So it's very important for us to continue to work together, because all of these crises are happening all over the world, not only in developing countries, in Europe too. And there are countries that are lax in recognizing these reproductive rights and human rights, and so it's very important for us to continue working together. Let's begin this panel meeting on violence against women and girls in situations of mobility in Latin America. Women and girls that are mobile because of displacement, migration, or refuge. And there's a very huge breach of their rights, and they're affected by different forms of violence, not only early marriage, which could affect women and girls in all contexts, but also rapes, all human rights, sexual harassment and attacks, trafficking, of course. We're seeing that in this country, the effects of women trafficking that come from Latin America and Africa, and recently from Ukraine. So I'm going to give the floor to Andrea Carolina Pacheco, who is from the UNFA, Colombia. Juan Carlos Pacheco, they are not related. He comes from Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. Benedetta Latera from Action Against Hunger, and Peggy Martinello from the FIAP. And we're going to organize this session with a series of questions, just to make it a little bit more agile. We don't have that much time. At 12:15 we have to end. So I'm going to ask the first question, which is, what violence are women and girls living through in movement in Latin America? Well, thank you very much, and a very good day to you all. Ladies and gentlemen, from the UNPAP in Colombia, we offer care to survivors in the framework of migrations for different types of violence that we've identified. There are many types. they have to leave their country and migrate, that in itself makes them exposed to situations of violence. Girls, boys, women, pregnant women, indigenous women, and from diversity point of view too. So there's all types of violence, physical violence, social violence, economic violence, net worth violence. The fact that having to leave everything behind, to leave their country and take refuge, ask for asylum and risk their lives, and those crossings are often managed by armed conflict in Colombia, for example, and so therefore they're exposed to sexual violence and they have to live through risky situations or through behavior that is difficult for them to be able to meet their basic needs. They don't have access to their basic services, and so we have feminicide, hate crimes because of diversity, race, and all of these things are the different types of violence that women and girls and adolescents are exposed to when it comes to taking the decision to migrate, to leave their country, to go to a new country, and they're exposed to new situations. In Colombia, we have different programs that we will see in more detail later, working to fight or to eradicate violence, and hopefully we'll be able to continue fighting to ensure that no woman, girl or adolescent will be affected by this gender violence. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invite to Spanish Cooperation. And the reasons as to why people in Latin America and the Caribbean are forcefully displaced are for various reasons. There are different dimensions that are linked to the forced displacement as a result of criminal violence, and there are armed players that, but the state itself and the effects of climate change, natural disasters, and these things affect different countries in the region. And it's important to remember that Latin America and the Caribbean has currently more than 20 million people displaced forcefully. That is about 20% of the global figure. So this is a very serious situation, and it's the most serious situation in the recent history in Latin America. And paradoxically, we're facing up to this most serious crisis in our recent history, and the financing for the response to violence based on gender violence and linked to mental health is the lowest ever in all of our history. And I think that this should lead us to international cooperation. We need to double our efforts to continue financing this response to ensure that women, girls, and all displaced people in Latin America are safe. Allow me to quote the following testimony. I think it's very important to share some stories from women and girls that we work with in HIAS in the region. This is a woman from Honduras, and I was sleeping. We knew it was a dangerous place, but we were so tired and we didn't care. But about midnight, some men with weapons came along. They took us to an isolated place. They asked for money, but we didn't have any. They told us that as we had no money, that I had to pay with my body. A Venezuelan girl, 11 years old, refugee, said, "To migrate is like losing everything. It's like being born again." And another message I wanted to convey, this is the effects that women suffer from on their migratory routes. In 2009, there were 175 women who died or disappeared on these migration routes, especially on the frontier between Mexico and the United States and the Caribbean, and many were still not identified. In 2022, between January and September, there have been 200 deaths and disappearances of women on those migration routes, and this means that the region is the second migratory route that is most dangerous in the world for women and girls that are migrating and are refugees. So to conclude, in a study that we carried out in the south of Mexico with refugee women from the north of Central America, they stated that the reasons as to why they're fleeing their countries is linked to sexual violence and territorial control of bands and gangs. That means they can't lead a normal life and to live in their communities normally. And so they find themselves forced to flee from their countries. And these risks are exacerbated on these migration routes as a result of the controls that these armed forces have, state forces, in particular in the crossing to the United States. I wanted to begin with some information and some figures. This year, there have been 240 women killed in Honduras, and if we were to adapt this feminicide rate in Spain, it would be more than 1,100 women up until now, which corresponds to all women killed that we have records for. That is the context in which there are millions of women losing their lives. And only in the month of October, there are more than 30,000 migrants who arrived. And in October of last year, there were 700. And this gives us an idea of the extent of what is happening in Central America with the arrival of migrants. We have an observatory because we work in the south of Honduras, and 20% of people that we have surveyed are women who travel alone with children. And the average, or most of those women, on average, have 2 children with them. One of them is underage, generally speaking. And so, therefore, why dare do this in the conditions that they have to live through to attempt to arrive to other places? And the reason, there's clearly a reason due to violence, but also in Latin America, perhaps one type of violence against women is exclusion. Before, our colleague from the CEPAP said that we've gone back 25 years in time, and hunger continues to increase. So poverty is increasing every year. Extreme poverty, we see that there is an increase, and the same is happening with hunger. There's an increase every year. But in Latin America, it's happening more so than in any other region. The gap between men and women is the greatest there. It's the region in the world where the gap, where women go hungrier than men. And so hunger, poverty, the lack of opportunities, and this mass fleeing from the job market that has come about because of the pandemic, and things haven't recovered. So these are all key factors that have pushed millions and thousands of women with their children to attempt to arrive to Honduras. And they start a journey that is full of difficulties and abuse. In fact, half of the women don't even dare to talk about what type of abuse they have suffered from en route. What women ask us most for in Danlitos are pregnancy tests. And that just gives us a very clear idea of what might have happened. Thank you. Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for the invite. And just to add an idea on the diagnosis, I quite simply wanted to mention 2 conclusions of a diagnosis we did in terms of people, situations of mobility in Latin America, in the framework of an action to build a regional model and a legal framework and help to people who are mobile, focusing particularly on women and girls. So it depends on the type of violence that they are suffering from in their migration route. Well, I think we've mentioned what the first leading one is, and there's the permeability of violence in all the cycles of that migration route from the time they leave to their arrival. And violence is the reason as to why they leave their countries often, and they live through moments of violence in transit and obviously in their countries of destination. An interesting element, and something that's quite striking in this diagnosis, is that many of the women and girls did not dare report what had happened to them, because there are 2 factors here that come into play and that mark these women, these migrants. Often they have no documentation in the territory where they find themselves, and this doesn't help them to have access to rights and be able to report these situations of violence. The other type of violence that became apparent was violence related to people trafficking. And here, a more general piece of information in the world is that 72% of victims of people trafficking are women, and 94% were for reasons of sexual exploitation. And it became clear in this diagnosis that there was a behavior that sometimes is not visible, but it also significantly affects them, and it requires a response on behalf of the public institutions, and that is corrupt practices and the facilitation of this trafficking. Corrupt practices that can be seen throughout the migration route, and here we're referring to charging money, but also sexual favors that civil servants get in return for perhaps things that are related to the people trafficking. And so I wanted to extend my discourse to see what these corrupt practices are about. And these are in a framework that comes under institutional violence that women suffer from. Migrant women not only live through moments of violence on behalf of people trafficking networks, but also on behalf of the institutions that should be there to protect them in the migration routes. So I will give you more information later as to how, based on this diagnosis, we try to accompany the institutions to prevent this from happening. Yes, that's my next question. And it's to see what you can do and the organizations you represent to mitigate this situation. Yes, thank you very much. Well, in our fund, United Nations Population Funds, we have a program that is wide in scope for this gender violence, and it's one of our objectives on the agenda is to prevent and to be able to reach out to those women, girls, and adolescents that suffer from this abusive violence. We have effective actions such as the case management and psychosocial support that may be in person or remote in moments of emergency, and in the migration routes and with populations that may be leaving their country or arriving at a new country. We have information, because in the fund we have as our mandate reproductive and sexual health. We provide information in the framework within the 24 hours after sexual violence. And we try to offer group therapy in the transformation of social regulations. And we accompany the leadership organizations led by women to bring about social change, to be able to bring about economic strengthening, and we help them to work in prevention themselves against gender violence in their communities. And a lot of these organizations are women's organizations with indigenous women, African women, and different nationalities, and we try to ensure that there is empowerment and to ensure they can continue working on the prevention of violence based on gender violence. We try to mitigate risks so that those women who live through situations of violence based on gender can, through monetary transfers, and adopt best practices to mitigate the risks of this violence and also be empowered and to provide economic independence. And like this, we have reduced the risk of situations of violence. We also have a procedure whereby we work in each department and in the countries on a national scale in terms of the prevention of violence based on gender violence. And all those organizations that work in this field then know how to deal with the situation, and like that they know how to act. We also provide coordination to the subgroup for protection on a territorial level in each department. In Colombia, for example, we have partners where we offer this guidance and coordination, and through our mandate we try to prevent this violence based on gender violence, and we offer all our support and work in Colombia at the moment.
In HIAS,
prevention and mitigation has 4 program pillars. And we're working in a comprehensive manner with the other pillars such as economic inclusion, legal protection, and mental health response and psychosocial support. And this has enabled us to develop a single methodology for comprehensive case management where survivors or those at risk of gender violence or exposed to other protection risks can access individualized case management processes and access different services, not just justice or reporting, but also receiving emergency assistance within 72 hours in the case of health and other types of assistance. And in that framework of protection, we train women leaders, community leaders, for the early detection of these risks, and we only refer, not only just in community centers, but also at the national level. And so we work with men and boys as well to prevent gender violence. With proven methodologies developed by different universities, and we make men, boys, and teenage boys community agents to favor gender equality in each of the territories. In addition, I wanted to point out two projects that reflect the strength of the organization in assisting survivors or people at risk of gender violence throughout their whole history, because people who are moving, and so we have to provide a package of assistance that will accompany them throughout their journey. So the first one is in Narian, thanks to Spanish cooperation, and we provide access to case management for gender violence in Panama, Colombia, and Costa Rica, what that's called the Darien route. And this year, more than 200,000 people have gone through this migration route, and we have accompanied survivors of gender violence, especially due to rape, disappearance, kidnapping, and I think it's key to accompany them during their whole migration journey, offering a minimal package of assistance so that they can be aware of their rights and the services available to them. And that's the project we're implementing in that area. And the other one is in the borders between Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. We're implementing a project thanks to the PRM funds for managing transporter cases, because in border areas there are very significant protection risks. So we are providing case managers for these women for their assistance while crossing a border, and so they can have continued assistance, and so they don't have to repeat their whole story at each border point. And that way we can coordinate the different services available on the different sides of the border. And as our colleague from the United Nations Population Fund said, another regional project is that we co-lead together with Save the Children, a gender violence program to respond to the needs of Venezuelan refugees and migrant population. And 2 months ago, we launched a needs analysis aimed specifically at gender violence survivors, and we estimate that by 2023, about 2 million refugees and migrants in Venezuela and the region will need case management services to respond to gender violence. And with the funds we have now, we can only cover 5% of the needs. And that's why we're making a call to the international community so they can redouble their efforts to fund case management and provision of services to survivors. And in Action Against Hunger, we have a line of work focusing on mental health, sexual and reproductive health, and primary health. But we also believe, well, I think all of us working with women are astounded at the strength that these women can have in these difficult conditions. And so we work closely with support groups, women's support groups. and we can see that they can provide lots of strength to each other. And we're doing this elsewhere in Honduras with the help of Spanish Cooperación, where by the end of 2020, the situation in the Sula Valley is that each time it rains, every time it rains, you have to pick up all your belongings and leave your home. And of course, many women and many families are thinking of leaving permanently. But of course, the journey is very difficult, and many women are deported, are forced to return. And so that's the area we're working in, with population that is at risk of displacement, but especially with women who have tried to flee but have been deported and have been forced to return. And another basic area of work is employment and entrepreneurship to enable women to be self-sufficient, and that's a driver of change in the long term. And we also think it's important to work at the territorial level, that understanding this as interactions between people, between institutions, between companies. And when we talk about gender violence and inclusion and overcoming inequality, this means individual change, but also a collective change, which has to stem from each territory, and it has to be supported by institutions. And so that's another area we're working in, working together with women's offices, wherever there are such offices, working with healthcare centers, so that they have every possible capacity to care for women at the different periods of care that they might need. And I'll stop here because I know we're running short on time. Thank you. In the FIAP, we support reform processes, public policies, and so we focus more on institutions who are responsible for protecting and caring for women who have been victims of gender violence. And I'd like to point out two areas of work that we are focusing on as regards women that are moving. The first one is safety, and it's related to the coincidence between organized crime and gender violence. We know that organized crime often recruits women and girls to exploit them. So we believe that focusing on combating organized crime is basic and that's why we support institutions that are responsible for preventing criminals from doing this. And so we are launching European programs, regional programs, especially in Latin American programs called Tacto Copolat. And I'd like to give you a specific example so you can see how by supporting these institutions we can change the future of migrant women. The Tacto program to combat organized crime includes an agreement on protection measures for women victims of gender violence in the sphere of Mercosur. This means that women living in Mercosur countries will be able to benefit from the same protection measures. Specifically, a woman from Uruguay, for example, who has a protection order in her country and who is traveling or migrating to another Mercosur country may benefit from the same protection order in the country where she's traveling to. This is an example. Obviously, it's a small example, but it reflects the importance of working in these institutional frameworks, institutional cooperation frameworks in the region. And I'd also like to mention that in the area of safety, we also work in Africa. We have a program in Nigeria to combat trafficking of women and girls, because we know that Nigeria is one of the countries of origin of trafficking in women who are exploited in Europe. And so we work in close coordination with state security forces, law enforcement, with other institutions, with NGOs, to prevent these women from being exploited so that they are aware of the risks of joining these networks, and also to support them when they are returning and protect them, and to be able to bring the criminals to justice. And the other line of work is comprehensive prevention and protection of women in mobility situations who've been victims of violence. What we want is to create this situation so they can demand their rights, and wherever they are in the countries of destination, the countries of transit. And what we do here also lets us look a bit further and consider discrimination as a form of violence against women, or the lack of legal protection or access to legal recourse is also a violation of the rights of women, and is also a form of violence against women. And here we launch European programs, but we also work in other areas of the world, and in particular in Africa. So that's all I wanted to tell you now. So now it's the most difficult question. What can we do in feminist cooperation to move forward and to stop taking backward steps in protecting women against violence? So Carolina? We continue and working against all forms of violence and inclusion from a development perspective. So in these past 2 years, we've learned that by working this way, we can transform communities and strengthen their capacities. At the national level, we have to go to each territory, and when we create exit plans in each territory for emergencies, we must take into account who is working in that territory with women. And sometimes we don't have enough institutions or public policies, so it's been women's organizations who keep working on protection and making routes safe. For example, in the Department of Chocó, which is one of our departments that have been hardest hit by armed conflict and by natural disasters, by migration, by Darien. So we've gone to very small villages where there's not even any public organization working for women. And it's been grassroots women's organizations who call us and tell us what's happening, tell us women are being killed, we need safety measures, we need protection. So I think our work should still be focused on empowering and building the capacities of these women so we can keep saving lives. There are 3 elements I want to put on the table. The first one has to do with community work, and especially women's leadership, the leadership of women, teenage girls and young girls in their communities. We have to continue strengthening that. And if we've learned something with these flows, it is that people who are in those mobility flows have the necessary tools and experience to be leaders of their efforts and to respond to the needs of their nationals or to other people in the same situation. And so I think that's a very positive element that we're seeing in the different programs that we implement in each community. There's a program in Ecuador called We Women Are United, and there are psychosocial support programs led by refugee women and local community women to strengthen integration processes in community. And I think we should strengthen these kind of programs. A second element, going back to what Rocío said in the first panel, has to do with the intersectoral and intercultural approach. And Latin American and the Caribbean is a very intercultural region. For 2 years, we've been working with indigenous Venezuelan populations that have been displaced by the crisis in their country of origin and who are now seeking protection in Guyana, in Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, and Brazil. We're talking about more than 20,000 people from indigenous communities who have suffered violence from non-state actors in the gold mines, and who are still exposed to the same risks, only multiplied, in the mines of Guyana. So I think that the humanitarian response to migrations has not always focused on the intercultural aspect, and we have to make a greater effort in that regard, not just in cooperation, but also in state institutions to emphasize work with cross-border indigenous populations. And finally, as I said before, when we look at the response plans for refugee population in Venezuela in 2022, a mere 5% was financed by programs to respond to gender violence. We need a commitment to continue financing, to increase our financing. Because, okay, today's November 25th, but in every day we need more help to finance the response to these people. I tend to be optimistic, but I have to say that the situation is not good. As we said before, there's the new global crisis, the crisis of the cost of living, is come to Latin America after an exhausting pandemic. Families have less capacity to face the increase in the cost of living and food prices, and just individually, but also at the government level. All governments have made significant investments in social protection systems for vulnerable people during the pandemic. And now with this new crisis, as we said at the beginning, crises, unfortunately, economic crises, health crises, are usually at the heart of these crises, unfortunately, are usually women. We have to be aware of this, of how the humanitarian needs in Latin America have tripled in these past 2 years. And this is not accompanied by a corresponding increase in aid. We are proud to say that Spanish Cooperation has made an effort and has increased its humanitarian funding in general, and in this region in particular. But the scenario is very complex. And as Action Against Hunger, we've been working in Latin America for 26 years, and we're seeing this happen. We're seeing that we need to provide, as soon as possible, assistance for urgent matters, like hunger that women are undergoing. We talked about marriage. We're seeing a very worrying increase in teenage pregnancy. And teenage pregnancy at a time of scarce resources and scarce food compounds the cycle of child malnutrition. The children being born will be malnourished like their mothers, unless we put an end to this. So we believe that we have to make a huge effort, and we call on the international community to get engaged in this joint effort, because we can play a role. These long-term changes that we seek require our sensitivity, and making that our feminist sensitivity, making that a reality on the ground. And I think that's what we consider a priority. And here I'd like to highlight 3 challenges for feminist cooperation of Spain. The first one, which was already mentioned in the first panel, is the intersectoral gaze. Incorporate this approach into cooperation programs, into public policies. These aggregated inequalities suffered by women in particular, migrants, women migrants who've been victims of gender violence. So we have to study what consequences this has, and we have to make public stakeholders work together. It's a multi-stakeholder job, and the different ministries need to sit together and work together. It means that different territorial levels have to work together. So I think this is something we have to incorporate. The second element, the second challenge, is continuing to mainstream the gender approach. When we're talking, especially in public policy, which means incorporating mechanisms to further women in the programs we implement, to incorporate institutions with this gender approach, incorporate gender-sensitive budgets, not just national budgets, but also budgets of cooperation programs that already have been designed with a gender-sensitive approach so that the necessary resources for women are available. And the last challenge I wanted to mention, when we talk about people in context of mobility, is the need to incorporate a migration route approach, because violence is committed throughout the route in countries of origin, transit, and destination. So it's necessary to coordinate actors and stakeholders and responses in all of the territories that this route goes through. And so perhaps we should emphasize multi-country or regional programs that enable interventions with this migration route approach, and also focusing on cross-border regions which are especially vulnerable, where people are especially vulnerable and subject to violence. Oh, and I wanted to take the opportunity to also say a little advertising here. And it's this week we've released a documentary called Journey, and I encourage you all to watch it, and we hope it will spark debate and awareness of this phenomenon. This documentary is about a migrant woman who leaves Venezuela and who takes a journey through different countries and reaches Brazil and suffers violence along the way. And so I really encourage you to watch it. It's available on the FIAP YouTube channel, and I think it can help explain, it can help you explain to the people you know what work we're doing in Spanish cooperation. So, thanks for letting me do this advertising. And so before the Q&A, I'd like to ask you the last question. Would you dare to send a message to women who have been victim of violence? My message is that we keep working to strengthen and accompany and assist and strengthen all our actions, but humanitarian actions, local actions, national and international actions, working with women and to prevent gender-based violence. More than conveying a message, I want to share these messages that have been given to us by teenage girls, young girls, and women. And so this is food for thought. These are just extracts from their statements. I would like to meet other girls like me, migrants, but also from here, so we can talk about what's happening to us. I need to learn more about how to prevent pregnancy. I don't know much about family planning. I also want to learn about that so I don't have to get married before time, because if you become pregnant, you have to get married to older people. I don't know what governments can do, because I don't know about what they do, but I wish they were less corrupt and they let us live wherever we want to live. I want to be a lawyer so I can defend people especially women, and fight for their rights. I want to learn about law so I can defend myself and others, to eradicate abuse. I want to be a writer, express what I feel in writing. I don't want to be asked for documents to be able to go to school. I'm afraid of mental health problems. People laughed at me, and nobody understands me when I have mental health problems. It's hard to convey a message. I believe in the strength of women, and they're not alone. And I also believe we have a problem of raising the visibility of women, but there are other types of invisibility. There's an invisible migration route, which is Central America. People get lost there. We don't know what's going on. So I want to talk about strength, and also about reporting and giving your statement and making yourselves visible. All of us who are there working and supporting them want to convey this message. And I would say that living in a free world is a universal human right, regardless of where you are born, where you live, where you move to, and ensuring this right is a responsibility of public institutions. And as a message for women and girls who have been victims of violence, I think that from Spanish Cooperation, we need to focus our work on strengthening these institutions to ensure their responsibility.
Bueno, pues empezamos, ya tenemos 15 minutos para... Súper, lo habéis clavado, de verdad. 15 minutos.
So we have 15 minutes now for the Q&A session.
Sí, está todo clarísimo, sí. Está clarísimo, y además estamos...
We are still quite shocked because the 25th of November, it's always a very hard day. It's always something to do with memory, remembering things, and we want to be alive, we want to be free, and these are human rights, of course.
Bien, si me dicen que también se pueden hacer preguntas.
You can also ask questions to the participants in the previous roundtable as well.
Si hay una pregunta.
There's a question over there. Microphone, please.
Hemos hablado mucho del rol de la...
We've talked about the role of women in fighting gender violence, but what is the role of men, both in humanitarian activities and in public policies? What is the specific approach that we need for men in this case? Thank you. When we talk about working for women, that means working for men as well. Obviously, when we talk about working with institutions and with family groups and with the private sector, when we talk about work inclusion, we need to carry out a very important and special work with men. In Latin America, unfortunately, they are still in charge of the most important decision-making jobs. And the other half of the population are men, so obviously we need to address them as well.
Desde la transformación.
I think we need to work from these transformation efforts. Unless we are able to work with men, it's going to be very difficult to have an impact. It's going to be much more difficult to achieve well-being and a life without violence for women. As my colleagues were saying, we need to work from an early age, from their childhood, with boys and men. Normally, we focus on women because they are the victims of this type of violence. Unfortunately, they were in a more vulnerable position. I think it is important to talk about structure, not just men or women. It's what the Secretary of State mentioned. We need to be able to avoid having the patriarch structure repeated in public structures. Obviously, when we talk about women as victims, we have to focus on them, but we need to take into account that we need a change in the organization of our structures, institutions, and in those cases, these training efforts can be for both women and men, because they need to be able to break this cycle and to avoid reproducing stereotypes in these public structures.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your comments and presentations. You were talking about prevention, and I think both panels mentioned the answer of the Spanish Cooperación regarding gender violence victims. Can I ask questions to the moderator as well? In this case, my question would be for the moderator. You have been talking about this feminist foreign policy, but could you give us a specific example of these in order to maybe tackle all these questions that have to do with prevention and that have to do with racism, discrimination, colonialism, so that we can see how you tackle all these problems with other institutions, how, for instance, drug policy affects these international responses, or the trafficking of weapons. It's very important to take all this into account. When we are working in the NGOs, we focus on victims, but it would be a good thing if we didn't have to do it anymore. I don't know whether you want to answer. Well, I can talk on behalf of this feminist foreign policy in Spain. As you know, we have been applying this policy for 1.5 years, and we're now working in a more structured way in order to have resolutions at political level. For instance, in the UN, we have several initiatives in the Human Rights Council. There was a declaration yesterday regarding Iran and the situation of girls and women in Afghanistan. Maybe I can give you a specific example so that you can see what we're doing. There is a link between the positioning of Spain in the multilateral level, in the Human Rights Council, in the Security Council. Then we also apply this approach in our regional relations, strengthening legislation frameworks in Latin America, and then we have the Spanish Cooperación, and then we work in the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We work also on the reform of the judiciary or justice systems in order to improve the situation of victims of any type of violence, not just gender violence. We are also working in the empowerment of women so that women can participate in decision-making mechanisms, and we're doing that with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Now we are highlighting the multilateral and regional level, and this has a certain effect. For instance, in the case of Afghanistan, we strengthen the humanitarian cooperation through the UN system, focusing on education and health for women and girls in Afghanistan. There are other sectors. For instance, we have the Consulate General Directorate, and we apply these policies to protect Spanish women against gender violence when they are abroad. So we're trying to have this political positioning at the highest level and then take this to the more practical level, at regional level, and then in these international organisms, we have this positioning. In the case of trade, we need to make a greater effort there. This is something new. We're changing the way we work in the ministry, and I think this is very important because we need to have the gender approach as a priority. So every time a political decision is taken, every time the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Secretary of State has a meeting with one of their counterparts, they must take into account the situation of women in those countries, and they incorporate an action plan. And I think this is very important. And there is something that has to do with sustainability as well. In the case of our foreign policy, we participate in the external action plan developing in all the countries. So we take this into account in the strategy for care, in the strategy for humanitarian diplomacy, in several strategies that we have. So we're trying to see how to work with all the different national policies that we have, and then how to participate in the different levels, from the highest political level to the most basic level. And we're seeing several changes in the way people take decisions and at the political level. And then what we see is that the staff at the ministry are helping us to make this change. In 2018, we had an 18% of women as head of delegation or ambassadors, and now we have 25%. So as you can see, there was an important increase in the last few years. We also have an equality department within the ministry, and from there we are promoting the participation of women in decision-making mechanisms in our foreign policy. Next month we will have a meeting with the high-level advisory group, which is included in the Feminist Foreign Policy Manual, and they will participate in the design of our foreign policy. This year we have been working with several organizations, but now we will have formally this meeting with the advisory committee. I'm a feminist. I'm an advocate of human rights. And I think this is something very important. We are currently creating this strategy. We need to see what has just happened in Sweden in the last few months. So we need to be very vigilant and think about the fact that we need to seize the opportunities we have now to make some progress. Because if there is a change in the political orientation of our country, all this could, mean nothing in the end.
Lo dejamos aquí, pues.
So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions and comments, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell you what we're doing. I think now we're gonna have the closing of the event, but we have a general moderator for the meeting, so I'll give her the floor, and then we can proceed to the closing of this event.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I'm back here with you. We're going to have the closing ceremony, but first I'd like to show you part of a video called In Transit. The full video is available on YouTube.
muy duro el vídeo.
Oh, it's hard to watch this video, but you can watch the whole thing on YouTube. And now we're going to close the event. And I'm going to give the floor to Anton Leis, who's the director of the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation. Welcome.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for all of you in Spanish Cooperation, from the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, for organizing such an important event. As we do every year on this date, Spanish Cooperation and our agency expresses our firm commitment to combating violence against women, girls, and teenage girls. And we want to join this effort towards feminist cooperation and calling out gender-based violence and violence against women as one of our priorities, as set forth in the Cooperation Act that was approved yesterday in Parliament. And please let me have this little moment to advertise and to congratulate our Secretary of State for International Cooperation, not just for her work and leadership as regards the passing of this act, but also for leading Spanish feminist cooperation and this law that includes this commitment that is so important for all of us. It's a 40-year commitment of Spanish cooperation, which we used to do feminism avant la lettre, but now we actually have the word feminism in our policy statement. Yesterday we celebrated that passing of the act, and now we are remembering and reminding ourselves how much we have to do yet, because gender-based violence is the most widespread and most underreported form of violence in the world. And it's a result of the structural inequality of women all over the world, in all places where Spanish cooperation is working. We can't just say violence, but we have to say types of violence, because there are many types of forced marriages and other kinds of violence. Forced marriage is one of these forms of violence that leads to exclusion and leaves women, millions of women, teenagers and girls, unprotected. As we said, 22% of marriages in Latin America, which is a middle-income region, are forced. And the International Labor Organization, fortunately, has classified forced marriage as a modern form of slavery. This violence is even more manifest in contexts of crises such as Afghanistan, Ukraine, etc. According to the United Nations Population Fund, 70% of cases of gender violence in the world happen in contexts of crises and of weak states. And we've seen in Afghanistan, in Ukraine, where we are assisting the Population Fund in assisting victims of gender violence. The world is seeing lots of major movements of population, and these generate situations of exploitation which lead to violence. More than 6 million people have abandoned Venezuela, and those of you who are familiar with Colombia, the areas where there's lots of Venezuelan migration, lots of them are women, very young women, and in many cases they are in very deplorable situations. Near Bogota, I visited one of these projects with the head of the humanitarian office, and we saw lots of teenage girls, aged 13 to 14, who were pregnant, sometimes even pregnant for the second time, with sexually transmitted diseases without access to gynecologists. And so we're facing lots of humanitarian contexts where women are suffering from many types of violence, sexual violence, the lack of sexual and reproductive rights, even in places like the United States, where there's been a significant reversal of rights. And we are also supporting the full exercise of those sexual and reproductive rights of women. And we're doing them with all the instruments available to us. Cooperation, including cultural cooperation. A few days ago, we inaugurated a cycle of plays in Guatemala. A group of women actors, playwrights, who are survivors of gender violence and who are touring Spain now. They are in Seville, and in 2 days, they'll spend 2 days performing plays about their personal stories. It's hard to watch, but it's very interesting because they even managed to include some humor in it. And as part of the Spanish Cooperation family, we will continue working to combat all forms of violence, working with multilateral organizations, with UN Women, with the UN Population Fund. In the latest donor conference, the Secretary of State announced a very significant donation. We've multiplied our contributions to UN Women by 4 recently to achieve the SDG 5 in its entirety, and the fight against gender violence, target 5.2, to which we dedicate approximately 40 million euros, about 25% of what we dedicate to all of SDG 5. Trying to assist women who are particularly vulnerable in humanitarian situations. When they attack one woman anywhere in the world, anywhere where Spanish Cooperation is working, they are attacking all of us, to all of humankind. And I think our dream, our goal is to have a world free of violence, where women, girls, and teenage girls can see their rights respected and protected, because this agenda is fundamentally a human rights agenda, and that's IC's commitment, and I think it's the commitment of all of Spanish Cooperation. Today we are commemorating, but also rolling up our sleeves to continue to combat this scourge in the world.
Thank you very much. And this has brought us to the end of this event, and I just simply wanted to thank all those people who have accompanied us today. Again, Casarabe too, for allowing me to participate and to moderate the panel meetings. And finally, I'd like to introduce you again to our Secretary of State for International Cooperation and President of the ECID, Pilar Canceda, who is going to close this act by reading the manifesto and with a minute's silence.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Lola. Before anything, I'd like to thank, on behalf of Spanish Cooperation, all men and women who have spent this time this morning with us. Today is a hugely special day, a day where there are a lot of events, lots of activities happening, and we're very grateful for the fact that you have opted to be here in this Act for Spanish Cooperation during this conference, where we have attempted to convey with this agenda and with the participation of those people who have formed the part of the panel meetings, and where we have spoken from the institutional point of view, to get an idea of what the commitment is for Spanish Cooperation. And also we work hand in hand with civil society and with NGOs and feminist activists. And at the end of the day, either we do this all together or else it's all a lot more difficult, and it would be practically impossible. So I think that the two matters that we have chosen for both panels are subjects that really reflect the crude reality, the situation of greatest vulnerability of women, girls and adolescents. And I truly believe that these have been two panel meetings that have been of great quality, a great deal of humanity, and those times that these women have lived through have been conveyed, and it does convey a message of hope, which comes from the hope and the involvement and participation on a daily basis. So we will continue to meet as we move in that direction. I'd like to mention the words of the director of the agency, who mentioned cooperation and the law for cooperation. We still have a step to go, as was said before, to get it through Parliament, but it is the result of working together. It's a very rich system, not only in this case the ministry involved, it's also the autonomous regions, local bodies, NGOs, the private sector, universities, and so it's a whole series of players where we can thankfully say we have a wonderful, sound cooperation system, but also the personal involvement of people who participate in the projects. And in that respect, I'd just like to recognize the work of all this team of Spanish cooperation, and in a very significant manner, the team with whom I work, we all work together on a day-to-day basis, and I want to recognize that fundamental work of the director of the agency, Anton, because quite sincerely, I think that without you, without your good work, your know-how and your rigor, and without your complicity in this feminist perspective, because if you were not to accompany us along these lines, then 51% of society and humanity would be fighting alone, and the remainder would be fighting against, or others just ignoring the whole matter. But I think that this has been a wonderful partnership, and I say this from a personal point of view, not only an institutional point of view, because it's been a very intense experience, very enriching, and I think that what we're doing is rendering a public service. We're here for that, and I think that in that respect we see this in Spanish cooperation. And without further ado, because I don't want to extend myself anymore, I'd like to read the manifesto that we have drawn up in Spanish cooperation. I wanted to share it with all you. The violence against women and girls constitutes a breach of fundamental rights that is systemic and generalized, and it's the most cruel expression of discrimination, the situation of inequality and power relations of men over women. The General Assembly of the United Nations decided in 1999 to declare the 25th of November the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, in an initiative of awareness raising on an international level. Today, in 2022, and despite the fact that progress has been made, gender violence continues to be a breach of human rights that is most extended in the world and that affects women in all areas of life. And when gender joins up with other matters such as sexual orientation, race, age, migratory status, disability, violence then is made worse by other types of discrimination. But we can't talk about violence in a singular format. We have to talk about violences in plural, to not forget any of the harmful manifestations of this praxis exercised against women, girls, and adolescents all over the world. The different gender violences do not know of frontiers, and they are made worse in contexts of crisis, as has become clear during the pandemic, now with the war in Ukraine, and in conflicts of instability and situations of instability where the pre-existing cases of discrimination have become worse against women and girls, and they are now exposed to greater risks in the breach against human rights. So therefore, today, Spanish cooperation signs this manifesto in order to support this International Day, and it expresses its commitment within the framework of the Spanish feminist foreign policy, establishing a struggle against gender violence against women and girls as a priority action, as is reflected in the guide for the feminist foreign policy approved in 2021. We are here. We express the commitment of this International Cooperation Spanish Agency for Development, the International Foundation for Iberoamerica or Latin America and the Administration and Public Policies, and the Carolina Foundation in the fight to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private field, including trafficking, sexual exploitation, and all types of exploitation. This is reflected in the initiatives of Spanish cooperation, which allocates a large amount of resources towards initiatives that go from supporting international bodies such as the UN Agency for Population, UN Women, the academies, associations for women and feminists, and civil society as a whole. Currently, there are more than 20 specific projects against the fight against gender violence, and they are being financed by Spanish Cooperación, in addition to many others, which the fight against violence against women and children are an essential part. And this is cross-cutting. In all countries with which we cooperate, and hand in hand with our partners in the system of international cooperation, we work in a comprehensive manner to combat violence against women, from prevention up to policies for social inclusion, including special attention to more vulnerable groups such as women, girls, and adolescents with disabilities, education in emergencies, protection and resilience of survivors of violence, the fight against forced marriages and violence against women, girls who are migrants and displaced or refugees. As the director of the agency said, this is feminist cooperation. It always has been, it is, and it will continue to be so, because we don't want to leave any person behind, any woman or girl behind, because that is our raison d'etre, and this encourages us on a day-to-day basis in our work. And now, if you like, let's hold a minute of silence, not because those minutes of silence or because of those declarations when we come together publicly and occupy streets is going to help to offset or make good what has happened, but it is true to say that we should pay tribute to their memory, to those women and girls that are no longer with us, because they didn't have the tools available to them, because they didn't have the resources available to them to be able to exit this cycle of gender violence. But it is to say to those who are here, who continue to be here, that there are means and ways of coming out of this, and we're here to give them a hand and to say that there is a way of escaping gender violence, certainly allocating resources with public policies, but also becoming involved from the civil society point of view. So this is a tribute to their memory and for those in the present and the future, so that we can act in solidarity and stop celebrating the 25th of November, because then that will mean there's no gender violence against women, girls and adolescents. So let's hold that minute of silence. Thank you very much.
Muy bien, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.